Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 64, Created for a Purpose. So many times on this podcast, I think I talked about it already, that I'm also writing some articles, and I wrote articles for this magazine Studium Integrale of this Studien of the study group Wort und Wissen in German, so word and knowledge in English. And there in this magazine, I recently found an article about some article other scientists wrote, which was called Evolution on Purpose. And this is was a discussion among evolutionary biologists where they were discussing something like evolution on purpose, so that they saw that there seems to be a purpose in nature and also in evolution, that there are things that are purposefully created, so to speak, and that even with all the concepts of the theory of evolution, you cannot omit that fact. You cannot remove the fact that there are many things in the beings that have evolved, that there's still some purpose that you can see in there, that you cannot get out of it. And they were trying to find a way to kind of scientifically, in the manner of the theory of evolution, to describe that. And this kind of seems to be nonsensical, because the theory of evolution, if you look at it, was kind of created to make this purposefulness of animals and of humans obsolete. Because and in this way, the theory basically eats itself, and it doesn't work anymore, because this is basically what it tried to do. So, first we need to talk about what this really means. So, the theory of evolution is not therefore disproved in some way, because you need to distinguish here between what you mean by theory of evolution. There are certain kinds in which you can understand this. So there's one thing which I think you have to accept is really factual in nature, and this is what many call microevolution. So this basically means adaptations that organisms do to their surroundings, which yet doesn't mean that they go over into other species. So this does not assume that there's like a tree from which where you see beings having descended from. So basically that apes and humans share the same ancestor and so on, where you do not go as far as to assume this would be macroevolution, but where you just acknowledge that as it can be shown in many cases, that there are species who adapted in a certain way to their natural environment, to their surroundings, and so on. But if this, I think, is established by science that this is really the case. However, macroevolution is in many ways it does not have this clarity, and it has many problems where things do not add up. So for once, there is this effect of convergence, as it is called. This is basically that if you look at many species and try to get to the same ancestors, try to get basically a pedigree, a genealogy of species in there, and then you will still find some species who have the same kind of attributes or features, but they have different genealogies. So they come from different they are not related in an evolutional sense. If you assume macroevolution, they are not related in any way. So the types or the things that they have developed must have become individually. So they need to individually have developed these traits, although they are pretty similar in the end. For example, there are species who have tusks, like elephants, for example, or also ancient species. And many of them have pretty similar tusks, but they are not related in any way. Or in macroevolution, you can find a way to have them relate to one another. And this kind of kills the whole point of it, because it basically says that they have these things individually or evolved individually. So why, since you assume macroevolution, because you see, hey, there are similar traits that these species have, so maybe they have a same ancestor, and then you compute all this through, and then you see there are still species who have similar traits but have they evolved separately without any relation to each other. Then you can basically drop the whole thing, in my opinion, because you don't have something more of explanation power, because you still need this effect of things coming into being separately from each other. And there are also many other things. For example, complexity is also one issue. That, for example, you for many features you have species or animals or humans have been developed together, and this would not make sense. For example, you could not have the large brains as humans have them without the womb of the females of the species also to have been expanded in a way that these big brains basically can go through the birth canal. This would only be possible if both things would have evolved at the same time, or one thing first evolved and the other evolved behind it. But then it wouldn't make sense, because then there would be purpose involved in it. Then there would be a clear structure. And also evolution also always assumes that everything that there is basically a random mutation, which then is better adapted than other mutations, or the state as is, and therefore they then win out, basically. This is how you get rid of all this purposefulness and so on. But this would then not work, because if you have just one part of the whole thing developed, then you don't have an advantage. You have a disadvantage, because you have the feature that you actually want to have, you don't have it, and you have just the mechanism to have the feature in a later way, and then you are actually at a disadvantage, but later you would be at an advantage, but you don't have enough time to wait for this mutation which makes you advantage, because now you're at a disadvantage, and so it in an evolutionary way it would die out before the feature can really come to pass. So therefore there needs to be some purposefulness included in nature, and this cannot be in no way ruled out by the theory of evolution. And these scientists, they came to this conclusion that this actually has to be, and that there has to be some kind of purpose in the way the mechanisms and the animals and so on evolve. And therefore you see there, this you can also only explain with one thing, that there is some design in how the beings are created. And still they try to theorize around this fact that this somehow might work without a creator, or without destination, without destiny, without a purpose and so on, but that there still might be some purposeful element in there or somewhere or something like that. And this reminded me of the scripture in Romans 1 verse 22, which basically says, although they claim to be wise, they became fools. And this is basically what you see often in this way, that you can... I mean, this relates also to the meme that we had about before, about the Gaussian, about the bell curves. I think it was in in the episode previously. But there you can also see that you can come to this arrogance, to this thinking of your that highly, that smartly, that you think you are wise, but actually you have become a fool. And this is here the case, because it's obviously the case that what these signs show, what it shows, that there is a purpose in how the species have evolved, or what the species have developed in their beings, that there is a purposefulness, clearly shows that there must be more than just random mutations that win out in some survival of the fittest principle. There has to be more to that, because it cannot describe it this way. So there has to be design, there has to be something beyond that. And I think scientists often run into this danger that in arrogance and in pride, they think they are smarter than they are, or they think they are wise, and then have become fools, because they cannot just take the fact, which this clearly shows, that there has to be some purpose involved in this, and that this purpose means there has to be some design, and this design has to come from somewhere. This cannot just occur naturally. There is not a natural principle of design in this world, but there has to be, design always shows that there has to be some conscious mind behind it somewhere, and this is what we would basically call a God. So this does not necessarily mean that you immediately need to believe and say, okay, there seems to be some design in this universe, so therefore there is a God. No, this is not what you have to do, but you need to acknowledge the design. If you see it clearly, then you need to acknowledge it and accept the consequences that come from it. That there seems to be something that designed this world, there's something that designed this universe, that there seems to be some purpose that is written into this universe, that we are not simply some products of random interactions, but that there is really some purpose that is written into our nature. And I think this is really important to understand this, because otherwise, you cannot do science this way, because then you clinch to theories that are not that fruitful anymore, and you miss the theories that might be a lot more fruitful than those. And I think this mentality you do not only see in science. This is kind of the mentality to you can see it also in art, and this is kind of this mentality, the delete Jesus mentality, you can call it. So it's basically what you want to do in science. You want to, the theory of evolution, it's a pretty successful theory, because it could describe many things, especially in the area of microevolution. But I think the problem it had from the beginning is that it was intended as an explanation how a world can work without a God. It was specifically intended to remove God out of the equations of science, and this is worked fine for some time. For a time it worked, and in some areas it works fine, but at some degree you cannot go on like this, because if there is a God, then somewhere he needs to show up. And I don't say that you need to write into an equation, okay, this is what God is. That's not what I mean. But if you rule out God completely from the equations, if you rule out the possibility of a God completely from the equation, then this is just as bad as writing him into every equation, because it will be just as bad, because then you also have made a decision about what you think is the reality beyond what science can state as the reality, as you have before. So therefore, what I'm in favor of is to be truly agnostically in a scientifically way about what if there's a God or if there's not a God, and basically let the science lead you as where it leads you. And if this is something where it's pretty apparent that there has to be some designer involved, that there has to be some God involved, then you don't need to state it explicitly, but you have to state the equations and the findings explicitly and clearly, that this is without any fear that this might lead to that creation and a God of creation, a creator, might be more probable than not. You just need to let it lead in this way. And I think in art you can also see often this mentality where basically this delete Jesus mentality where you want to write God out of the equations, although he's clearly in them. So one example for that would be Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, which is a book which I maybe in a later podcast or the new podcast I will talk about it some more. It's a pretty fascinating book. I recommend you to read it. It's really great. Therefore, I will not try not to spoil you much of it. But in the end, there is some scene where basically he has committed to his crimes. This main character, Raskolnikov, he has committed to his crimes, and then basically he has this moment where he says, hey, this woman that I knew, she had this New Testament and she believed in God and so on. And now that I have come clean, basically, this God could also be something for me. He could be to write for me, right? He has this New Testament that he starts reading, and so it's pretty obvious that he basically became a Christian in the end. And this is oftentimes still completely ignored or ruled out, or Raskolnikov is stated like some social liberator or something like that, depending on which political ideology one has or one hasn't. But still, this is actually not what's written there. It's clearly, I mean, every work of art you can interpret in different ways. That's fine, but it's clearly written there about him coming to Jesus, coming to Christ, finding Christ. And if you ignore that, then you ignore parts of this work of art, of course. Another case which maybe makes it more clear is the movie Walk the Line. It's a movie about Johnny Cash. And Johnny Cash, it's a biopic about his life, of how he started, how he became famous, and how this worked out for him. And then basically what happens is that he goes into drugs and he has a lot of affairs. His marriage falls apart and so on, and he's really a mess. And but in the end, he kind of turns around. He goes to prisons and sings for them, and has really his life turned around and sobered up, and so on and so on. And this in the movie, it kind of just happens, and he has some kind of wake up call and thinks, okay, maybe I shouldn't do all this drug related stuff and so on, and he does other things. But in reality, what happened was that he became a Christian. He came to Christ. So I think he grew up in a religious way. So he also knew some of that. And then when he became famous, he lost his faith and went into drugs and all this stuff. And then in the end, he got back to his faith. He became a Christian, and therefore his life changed, and this was observable for everyone. This was to see for everyone, and this was the change that occurred here. But you cannot really understand this change or how this change came about without understanding that he really came to Christ, that he really came to Jesus, that this was part of his transformation. This is not to say that there are no people who, without having such a moment, change their life in one way, and you can argue about what this really means or how much of faith is involved in there. This can be open up for debate, okay, but in his case, in the case of Johnny Cash, this transformation came by his faith, came by the fact that he became a Christian, and therefore you have to show this accordingly. Otherwise, you are leaving it out. Otherwise, you're basically lying. And in another case where you could see it in a similar way, which is one example which I also want to mention, is Unbroken. It's a movie about Luigi Zamperoni. He was basically a Olympia runner, and then he was in the Second World War, and he was encamped by the Japanese, and he was brutally tortured there, especially by one warden. And after he returned to the US, he was part of Billy Graham's revival ministry, and he really had this revelation of forgiveness, and he reached out to this one in Japan and said, hey, I want to meet you, I want to forgive you, and so on. He never reacted, but he was preaching this great message of forgiveness, this powerful message of forgiveness with all he had to endure, and he managed to forgive the people who were torturing so badly, and so it's a great testimony of power forgiveness. However, the fact that this came about to he turning his life to Jesus, to coming to the Lord, is never mentioned. It's in a movie. It's never mentioned. It's completely ignored, and this is, of course, not honest. This is what led to his transformation, and therefore it needs to be in there if you really want to have basically the truth. And this is not to be here critical about some things. You did not mention that my heroes are all Christians or something like that. That's not what this is about. It's basically what we want to do in science, of course, is we want to grasp some truths. We want to grasp the truth, the scientific truth, the truth that we can know about matter. And in art, we do a similar thing. We want to grasp the truth about things that lie beyond science, the things that lie in our experiences, in our inner life, in this, and we want to grasp the truths about this. And therefore, we want to grasp the truth. But if we are not truthful about this, about what we really measure, about what we really see, about what is really there, then we cannot grasp it at all. Then we will fail at doing so. So if in science everything points to a creator who created this world with design, or designed this world in a purposeful way, if everything points that way, that does not necessarily mean that we need to say, okay, you need to believe in God, end of story. That does not necessarily mean that, but it means that we need to acknowledge the fact that the science shows in this way, and not try to mingle and move around to get into this whole thing into another direction. And in the same way in art, if we have these biopics, if we have these stories, these fascinating stories that people say, hey, this we want to make a movie out of that, or we want to make a book out of that, and then, or we have this fascinating story written from Dostoevsky, which moves us deeply, and then to say, okay, we just change minor parts that we do not like, then we lose this grasp of the truth that we want to actually have, and then we cannot grasp it anymore properly. And I think this is what this delete Jesus mentality basically does. It, if you are not a believer, and if you don't care about all of that, okay, but still, then you should still be against this delete Jesus mentality, because what it does is not only remove faith out of these stories, it just removes truth out of the stories. Because the truth of the matter is, whether you believe in a God or not, the transformation in the lives of, for example, Johnny Cash came because he came to faith, because he became a believer in Christ. That was his transformation. That's just the fact. Whether you believe that any truth is in there or not, the truth is that this was what led to his transformation, and therefore to ignore this completely is basically ignoring the story, is basically ignoring the truth behind the story, and therefore this is it's not honest, it's not truthful, and it will not grasp the truth. Therefore, these artworks cannot achieve what they try to achieve, to grasp truths that are hidden in these stories. And therefore, in the same way, science cannot grasp the truth that it tries to grasp if it ignores the points where the facts that it finds lead to. And what I argue for, what I understand that it is hard to find this balance of being objective and saying, okay, we want to show where the science, or let science lead us where it wants, basically, but at the same time also to not be too objective, to be led where science actually leads us. And I think there's also the case that you cannot, even in science, even this is shown in quantum mechanics, this is that you cannot be even objective at all, because even having some quantities that you measure, that there's already subjectiveness baked into the cake, basically. But it's another story. But speaking of quantum mechanics, I think the approach that is there taken from the Copenhagen interpretation, or this Copenhagen approach, as I call it, is the way to go. That you basically say, yeah, we have these all these theories, so we let science lead us where it seems, and we are completely agnostic about everything else. So we say, as in the Copenhagen interpretation, you say, yeah, these particle interactions and all this stuff, there seems to be some randomness involved. We just accept it as it is. We say it is like that, we accept it, this is our interpretation, and done. And then you can have your own interpretation, you can interpret it in this way or in that way, but that's not really what we talk about here. We do science, we do it like that, and you can interpret it in all kinds of different ways, and that is fine, nice and fun, but this is not anymore really more science. It's more kind of philosophical science and so on, and to really make this cut. And I think this would be necessary to do this also in other ways, for example also in the theory of evolution, to just say, okay, we have the facts here, it seems to be leading to some purpose in our nature, it seems to lead to that there might be a designer behind it, but we do not really care about that. We just state it as it is, and you can make up your own conclusions from that. But to not go in one way or the other, to not try hard to in some way write God out of the equation, but of course in the other way also to not try hard to write God into the equation, but is simply stating the facts as they are, and then everyone can see them for what they are and make up his own conclusions. I think this is the best way to do it. I'm sure I know this is not as easy as is being said, but I think this is what we need to try out to achieve, and therefore I think we need to in the theory of evolution, we need to understand that there seems to be a purposefulness in this world, and this just needs to be accepted. We just need to say, okay, this is how it is. What it means, we don't know. I know, so it means, I really believe it means that there is a creator who created each of us with a purpose. This we can see from there, in my opinion. But I think as scientists, one would need to say, okay, we just state it as it is, and beyond that, everyone can make up his own mind. So far for this episode, and so far for this podcast. So this is it. This is the last episode of the According to Sci-Faith podcast. So don't worry, there will be other episodes coming, but they will be coming from another podcast, and I will keep you in the loop about what this podcast is, and the episodes from this new podcast that will be coming then will in some parts of this podcast will also be uploaded here, and this podcast will of course remain online, so you can still listen to all the episodes and so on, but the new episodes will then also be published here, and then I will hope you will make the switch to this new podcast where there also will be some more topics. If you have listened to this episode, or you obviously have listened to this episode, so you know I was talking a little bit about artworks, about making there a comparison. I will do this, I think, in a new podcast. Also, I will also talk more about art, mostly about literature, about books I read, what I like about those books, what impressed me about them, what I think, how you can interpret them, especially from a Christian worldview and so on. So if this is something for you, just keep in mind I'm doing this as a non-expert, so I think I can consider myself an expert in the area of science, since I studied it for more than 5 years, and I have written thesis on these topics. So I think I'm kind of an expert, maybe not the uppermost expert in these areas, but kind of an expert in these areas. But I wouldn't say I'm an expert in literature. I just read the books, and Some I like, some I don't, and I talk about why or why not, and I understand many concepts of it. So maybe I'm an expert, maybe I'm not, but at least I'm not a studied one. So take what I say with a grain of salt, and it's not to say what you have to believe about it. I just want to share what I think about these, what I think about art in general, what I like about it, what I don't like. Also about my own books, of course, what I'm writing myself. I will share some of that. And it's just also for me what I like, what I think it's interesting about it, what's also I think relevant for us from this. And then you also can make up your own mind. You can also discuss with me. So I will also publish this on my Substack, and every podcast episode will also have a related Substack article. At least that's the plan for now. And then you can also discuss with me there, or to discuss with others there about what you think it is, and so on. So I'm looking forward to doing that, and I hope you will make the switch, come to this new podcast. It will be a lot of fun, I hope, and I will try to keep the schedule. So try that after this podcast episode is published, that basically the week after, maybe I will need some time. I'm not sure yet, but I hope that pretty neatly afterwards I will be able to publish episodes on a new podcast. They will be published here, so just wait for them to come, and then I hope you will make the switch and we will hear each other soon.